Hello friends and welcome. Today we are finally going to chat about my favourite middle grade books from 2023. I am a children's bookseller, so I do read a lot of children's books, but the books that I want to talk to you about are the books that I just personally loved. There's quite a mix in here. There's some heartwarming contemporaries, there's some mysteries, there's some fantasy, there's some graphic novels, of course. And I knew right away what my top 9 books of the year were, and then I had 2 books that were kind of vying for that 10th position, and I've decided to just tell you about both of them. So we have a top 11, but let's just dive right in, and I have ranked them. So number 11 is The Extraordinary Adventures of Alice Tonks. Alice, our main character, is autistic, and Emily Kenny, our author, is also autistic. So it's an own voices autistic story, and it's a fun take on the magical child trope. Basically, we meet Alice when she is starting at her new boarding school. She's very nervous. She's had not so much luck making friends and especially making first impressions in the past. So she's very conscious of putting her best foot forward at this new school. But on her first day, something kind of strange happens. A seagull talks to her. After casually offering this little seagull a chip, he says out loud in English right to her face, "It's not your chips I'm after, Alice Tonks. We've got a job for you." And basically early on in the story, we discover that yes, Alice can speak to animals. It's a rare gift that some people have, and the animals don't always trust humans, even the ones that they can talk to, but they've decided to reach out to Alice because animals are going missing. And so they're putting their faith in Alice and asking her to help them find out what's going on. Who is stealing animals and why? So it's a fun, sweet story, obviously, definitely for kids who love animals. Come on, wasn't it all of our dreams to be able to talk to animals at some point? I especially love some of the relationships in particular, like the young friendships that developed in this story. It was thoughtful, it was sweet, it was fun. I had a good time. My 10th favorite middle grade of the year was The Sideways Orbit of Eevee Hart. And isn't this just such a pretty cover? This is one of those heartwarming contemporaries. We follow a young girl named Eevee who some have described as potentially neurodivergent coded, and essentially we meet her at the beginning of a big change in her life. She's the older sibling and they live with her mother and their stepfather. And essentially these parents have sat Eevee down and let her know that they are going to be splitting up. And the parents have given the kids quite a bit of a heads up. Basically he'll be staying until the end of the school term, and then that's when he'll be leaving. And so essentially Eevee has about 10 weeks to come to terms with this. And it is during this school term that Eevee's class is learning about space. And so basically we follow along as Eevee is exploring her thoughts and feelings about, what's happening to her family through the lens of space. She thinks about things like gravity and how maybe that could be a metaphor for relationships and how things sometimes drift apart. I think the way that space is used as a lens to explore relationships and family dynamics and responsibility to each other and to ourselves was just really beautifully done. So another sweet book. It's very tender, it's very raw and honest, and I really enjoyed it. Okay, now for my number 9 pick. This is my first graphic novel on this list, and it is Ghost Book. This is such a fun story. It's also quite moving. I did cry. Basically, it's set during Hungry Ghost Month, where the veil between the worlds is thin and the gates of the underworld are open, which means that there might maybe be some ghosts and spirits kind of moving about the place. And our main character July meets a boy who she believes is a ghost, and she helps rescue him from some hungry ghosts that are after him. But they both quickly discover that he's not actually technically a ghost. Instead, he's a wandering spirit who's kind of caught between life and death for some reason. Obviously, it's a ghost story, so it's just the perfect amount of a little bit eerie, a little bit scary, but also it has so much heart to it, and at the center of it is this friendship. The illustrations are so colorful, so beautiful. I read this in one sitting. I couldn't put it down. Loved it. Now we're back to the novels for my next pick. This is Huda Was Here by H. Hayek, and this is technically a sequel, but I still haven't read the first book, so I don't think you need to read them in order. Basically, in this book, we're introduced to this large, very close-knit family, and our narrator's name is Akil, and his younger sister is Huda. But at the beginning of the book, we find out that their father, who's a security officer who kind of patrols their neighborhood to keep everybody safe, has just been laid off from his job. So Huda, being the youngest sibling bar their baby brother, she is just a menace. I don't know how else to put it. Basically, she concocts this plan and she ropes Akil in with her to go around the neighborhood at night and commit crimes, to basically convince the neighborhood that it's actually not safe anymore and they need to hire their dad back. Now, obviously these are good kids and their intention is in the right place, even if maybe they're not going about it necessarily the best way. So when I say crimes, the first thing they do, I think from memory, is they graffiti with chalk. And Akil is basically just along for the ride because he wants to make sure his sister doesn't get herself into too much trouble. Honestly, it's Huda who's the mastermind behind this whole thing. So it's just hilarious. It's kind of chaotic just watching the two of them get into more and more mess. But along the way, a mystery does develop. Now, I know this won't necessarily be for everybody. I have heard some people find this more stressful than fun, but for whatever reason, the tone just absolutely worked for me and I was laughing out loud. I was cackling. Next up, we have a true blue mystery, and that is the Montgomery Bonbon. This is the first book in the series. This one is called Murder at the Museum. Now, this book that I have here is just the proof. The real cover looks like this. And basically in this first book in this series, we are introduced to Bonnie, who is a young girl who has a really sweet, lovely relationship with her grandfather, but she also has a secret alias as the world's greatest detective, Montgomery Bonbon. And at the start of the book, Bonnie and her grandfather are just having a lovely day out at the museum when they hear a big bang, the lights go off, and they hear a scream. And immediately, Bonnie knows that Montgomery Bonbon is going to be needed, so she like throws on her big jacket, she puts on her little beret and her fake mustache, and she gets onto the case. And her grandfather is the only one who knows this secret, and he serves as like her assistant, her Watson, if you will. I love their dynamic and I just had so much fun with this mystery. The mystery itself and the way that it's unveiled feels very like old-timey mystery. We're in a small town and we have a handful of suspects and we go and interview different people and we get to watch along as Bonnie is putting these clues together. And then at the very end, we have a great reveal in front of everybody. This was honestly quite a surprise for me. I hadn't really read anything like this before and I just loved it. Next up, we have two more graphic novels and they're by the same author, so we'll talk about them together. And they are two of my favorite graphic novels that I read this year from Kay ONeal. Obviously, Kay ONeal is the author and creator of the Tea Dragon Society, which is just my favorite thing. Dewdrop is very sweet, and honestly, this is more junior fiction than middle fiction, but I had to include it. I couldn't help it. Basically, Dewdrop, our main character, is an axolotl, and there's a competition happening, and it's just about celebrating everybody's own strengths and like having fun with competition rather than like getting too serious about it. It's also just about camaraderie and community and friendship, and it was just delightful. The other one is Aquicorn Cove, and I think this might be a very close second to the Tea Dragon Society as far as my favorites of Kay ONeal go. I just loved this. This is a really sweet, I'd say middle grade story. And it's got a very strong environmentalist message. We're basically situated in a small community in a small seaside town, and we watch as their relationship to the land and the sea in particular changes over the course of this book. Our main character Lana is a visitor to this town. She has family here, and while there, she discovers an aquicorn, which are these cute little sea creatures. It's unfortunately injured, so she decides to try and take care of it and nurse it back to health. I don't really want to tell you too much more than that because obviously it's very short, but I just thought it was such a beautiful, moving, touching exploration of, like I said, environmental impacts and our relationship to our landscapes and where we live, our responsibility to the places we live. But it's also about grief and loss as well, and friendship and community. It was just beautiful. I loved it. Number 4, we're getting close to the top now, is A Deadly Daylight by Ash Harrier. This is the first book in the Alice England mystery series. I read the first 2 books, which are the only 2 that are out so far. I loved both of them, but I do have to say that I think the first book is really something quite special. This series is also a mystery series, but I would say it's a little bit darker, a little bit edgier, and it probably like aimed just that little bit older. I would say 10 plus. There are also some very light magical elements in this story too. In particular, our main character Alice does have a special ability to basically like hold objects of a dead person and see some of their memories, which, considering the fact that her father is an undertaker and they live at a funeral home, is a gift she gets to use quite a lot. Early on in the book, we discover that a man has been found dead down by the pier. And of course, his funeral is held at Alice and her father's funeral home. And so she gets to hold some of his objects and gets little glimpses into his last moments, and they just don't line up with what the police have been saying about his cause of death. And so Alice starts asking questions, and along the way she makes some friends. Alice is another character that to me was very much neurodivergent coded, and there's also other disability rep in this book. And I think there's just some really interesting questions, especially around autonomy and like protection versus control when it comes to disability. This wasn't necessarily like the main part of the story, but it was there and I just loved it. Okay, we're into the top 3 now. Number 3 was The Trouble with the Two-Headed Hydra, which is the second book in the Miss Mary Kate Martin's Guide to Monsters by Karen Foxley. Oh my God, what a tongue twister. I really enjoyed the first book in this series, but this second book took it to a whole nother level for me. This is another mystery series. I'd say that this is targeted to 7 to 10-year-olds. Mary Kate is a young girl who has a lot of anxiety, and the way that her anxiety is spoken about and the way that she kind of manages it is one of my favorite things about the books. But her mother is a very kind of like put together academic archaeologist kind of person, and she's an expert in her field. So she often gets called out to old places where there are strange things happening. And Mary Kate gets to tag along on these adventures with her, and her mother encourages her to ask questions and to research. And while Mary Kate is quite anxious, she's also a very thoughtful, observant, and compassionate girl with a love for stories. And so when she's kind of like following her mother along, she often starts to wonder if some of these unusual occurrences might have less to do with whatever her mother thinks they might be, and more to do with folklore and the creatures of folklore of the area. So in this second book, Mary Kate and her mum get called out to this little Greek island. In this case, there's a beautiful mosaic that the mother has been called out to assess. But upon arrival, Miss Mary Kate starts to learn that a bunch of piers and boats have been destroyed recently. The color red seems to keep appearing in strange places all around the islands. And there is an interesting story, a folk tale about a two-headed hydra in the region. And so while her mum is doing her work with the mosaic, Miss Mary Kate decides to travel around the island and talk to the locals to try and find out what's going on. So these books are just such a delightful mix of mystery, adventure, with a bit of mythology thrown in as well. It's a story about bravery and kindness and friendship, and in this second book in particular, there's also a big theme of environmentalism too. I really love this series. I highly recommend it, but this second book, to me, absolute chef's kiss. Loved it. Okay, now my second favorite book of the year is actually a graphic novel. So this was my favorite graphic novel of 2023, and it is the beginning of a new series. I cannot wait. It is Lily Halfmoon, and this first book is called The Magic Gems. I just love this. This art is so beautiful. In this story, we meet Lily just as her family has moved towns and she's having to start at a new school. She's really nervous for all the reasons you would normally be nervous to start at a new school, but especially for Lily. Strange things just seem to happen around her sometimes. Like sometimes a book will levitate or a pencil might move across the desk, and she's really scared of the other kids finding out and thinking she's weird. But on her very first day, the opposite happens. Instead of thinking she's weird, some of the other girls recognize that Lily is actually a witch just like them, and so they invite her to join their little witch club. And like in their little witch club, they get to do some like studying and learning, and they also get to meet and find these cute little animal familiars. I also love how throughout the book we kind of get these almost like textbook or grimoire pages spread in amongst the story. Like I just would have loved this sort of stuff as a kid. I love it now. Who am I kidding? It's so pretty, it's so delightful, it's heartwarming, it's so cute, but it's still like a solid adventure too. Parts of this, and I think especially the artwork, reminded me a little bit of Lightfall, which is my favorite graphic novel series of all time. And other parts of it, I think maybe those little animal familiars and like the sweetness and the focus on friendship did remind me a little bit of the Tea Dragon Society. This is its own thing. It stands on its own 2 feet, and obviously the plot is entirely different to either of those. But to me, this stands amongst those kinds of graphic novels. I just thought it was wonderful. And for how much story and character development got packed into such a short page count, I just think is honestly really quite impressive. This first volume in and of itself was so fun. It was such a great setup, and there's just so much potential here, you know? I can't wait. Okay, and finally, are we ready for number 1? I feel like some of you know exactly what's coming next. This is honestly one of my favorite books that I read last year. If I didn't do separate videos, I would have put this in my top favorite videos of the year video. That's how good this was. It is, of course, Impossible Creatures by Katherine Rundell. Now, Katherine Rundell is a well-beloved author. This is the first book of hers I've ever read though, and oh my God, did it blow me away. I don't know that I want to tell you a huge amount about this book because in a lot of ways, this is classic standard kind of fantasy, but equally it's done with so much heart and personality, and it's all executed borderline perfectly, which all just comes together to elevate it completely. And it feels like the sort of book that should go down in history as a classic. The writing in this is just so lovely. It's very clear, but it's also just like the right level of descriptive. It's so evocative and immersive. Basically, this is a portal fantasy story. We get to know a young boy named Christopher who basically finds himself in a portal realm. And there he meets a girl, Mal, who has this tiny little dragon as her best friend. And she essentially informs him that magic is dying in this portal realm that he's found himself in. It's called the Archipelago. And if they don't fix the magic soon, then her dragon is going to die. So she needs Christopher's help. I love at the beginning of the book, we've got this little section where we get kind of like an introduction to a whole bunch of, you know, mystical creatures. And there's like a good 10 pages of this or so. And I just loved that every single one of those creatures we meet in this story at some point. Some just in passing, others end up becoming, you know, prominent characters. I just thought that that was such a fun touch. And I think just added to this whole world feeling so alive. The characterization was honestly just incredible. I fell in love with Christopher and Mal almost immediately. I was so invested. I cried, I laughed, I just could not put this down. I honestly don't think I've had this much fun with a fantasy adventure middle grade since Nevermore. And honestly, I think in some ways this might almost be better crafted than Nevermore. I love Nevermore, don't get me wrong. This was just honestly phenomenal. I can't get over it. I have not stopped recommending this book, and 3 of my other colleagues at work have also read this recently, and we're all obsessed with it. We keep selling out because we keep hand selling this to everyone we get a chance to. It's rare that we all agree on a book, but we all agree on this one because I just think it's really, really something quite special. So those are my favorite middle grade books of 2023. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I love chatting middle grade. If you plan on picking any of these books up on my recommendation, I would love to hear in the comments below, and I really hope you enjoy it. If you have your own middle grade recommendations that you think I need to know about, please leave those in the comments below. A big thank you as always goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown and Marie. And thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, so much love and happy reading. Bye!